Welcome back to the 2JZ VVTi swap on the S13 Coupe. So today we're going to be mounting the transmission, but first we have to be putting a new bearing here on the back of the crank. And by the way, the bread trick works so good. Punch a bunch of bread in there and push it out, and then the old bearing comes right out. Tap the new one in. And once you have the new one tapped in, you want to check the back side of the crank, make sure that everything is smooth. Maybe take some sandpaper to it and then clean it up. Also take all the grime. You want this flat and smooth as possible, so that way there's no vibration on the flywheel. And before I put the bolts in, I like to take some RTV and put some at the ends of the bolt. Some people will say that if you don't, you might have a little bit of oil seep through. I want to say on my Supra, I use red Loctite and I didn't have anything come out. Use a 1.5 inch 12-point socket and then start putting some of these bolts in. I like to do a cross pattern here, that way I can keep track as far as which ones have been torqued, and also like to try and put these on evenly with the flywheel. I like to have the flywheel sit as evenly and flat as possible on the back side of the crank. That way, again, we mitigate or rather eliminate any and all vibrations going through the drivetrain. So I'll basically put these in by hand, and then the first set, the first 4 cross, I will by hand put them down to the edges of the flywheel, and then those will be the first ones that I'll end up torquing. And once that first cross is done, I'll do the second cross by hand and then torque those as well. And again, this is mostly just to keep the flywheel as flat on as possible. I like to do this at any time that I have a kind of like a symmetrical circle, square setup, whatever, throughout the engine. It's just do everything in stages. And as you can see here, there's the first 4 tightened down by hand, and then I do this all with torque wrench in several stages until I get to 60 foot-pounds. Okay, let's take a look at some of the ISR parts that we got for our 2JZ swap. So this is a 2JZ mount kit that I bought for the S13 specifically. This will come with the motor mounts and will also come with the transmission mount. Essentially everything you need to put onto your 2JZ or 1JZ and drop into the S13. But beforehand, it's a good idea to pull everything out and make sure that you have everything within a box and that there are no missing parts. Check all your labels, make sure you have the transmission mounts, brackets, hardware, and then the motor mounts, bushings, brackets, hardware, everything. You want to do this soon because you don't want to pass your return window, and with some companies incur a pretty hefty restocking fee. I love stickers. Stickers, as you can see, I put them all over my toolbox, trash cans, whatever. I don't put them on my cars, but yeah, more ISR stickers. So last box here, open this up, check it out. Make sure everything's in there, but it's a pretty heavy box. We got a lot in here. Let's check out the transmission mounts now. Make sure we have everything we need. So we're going to be looking for the bracket, the hardware, and the puppy is going to help me out in looking for these things. And this box was fairly heavy. This came with the cross member as well as the hardware. The hardware did have a little bit of rough edges on the threads, which as I tested them later, they still seemed to thread right in. So I went ahead and kept it. I didn't try to return these or call the ISR company. Everything seemed to work really good. So again, super heavy, super sturdy stuff here. And then we have the transmission mount itself. Also pretty hefty, comes with all the hardware, looks good. Moving over to the engine mount. So you open this, again, like every other box, make sure you have everything you need. One of the cool things that ISR does is on their printed instructions is they'll also give you a packing list. So you can actually look at the instructions and figure out what all hardware and brackets are included with this, so that if there is anything missing, you can either call them or rather call your distributor company that sold you the parts and get it sent back to get all the correct stuff. But as I went through the list later, it looked like I had everything I needed. The mounts are really heavy. They're sturdy. They're great welds. I really like the ISR mounts for the 2J swap for the S chassis. As mentioned earlier, there is a packing list that comes with the instructions here. So going over the instructions are pretty detailed. I like that the pictures have colors. They show orientation as far as where everything should go, and you can always double check that all the hardware is present. And as for the clutch, I am using Clutch Masters FX850.
All right, so we just got the R154 transmission bolted up to the 2JZ motor. Had a lot of difficulties doing so, even though with an R154 measurement tool here, or rather an alignment tool, We had torqued it initially to spec and then tried to slide the transmission on, didn't work. Reaccomplished again, realized that it was the clutch pack was a little high, did it again, still wasn't going. Best thing we did to get this to slide on actually with real ease, and it just slid on like butter, was torquing the entire clutch pack to spec and then just backing off about 1 or 1/4 turn on all the bolts all the way around. Also doing the star patterns so we don't have any uneven torque being applied or unapplied rather in this case to the clutch pack, which allowed us a little bit of play and movement within the clutch pack. Push this in, everything just kind of lined up and slid right onto the input shaft, and then we're able to line it up onto the dowel pins and tighten these bolts on to be able to have the motor, or excuse me, the trans flush with the motor. So what that allowed us to do is that you always want to make sure that if you are having some gaps between the transmission and the motor, is that you're not using bolts to force that gap close, because you could be bending a clutch disc, you could be bending your input shaft maybe, worst case, or it's just maybe you have a line or something caught in between the bell housing and the block, so you never want to force it. So once we had this slid on to the dowel pins, we realized that we were in a good place where we can put these bolts on, and we put about 4 in here just to make sure we get a nice good seat against the block and allow this thing to just kind of rest now without having any issues. So everything's put together, so we're going to go back now, do the inspection covers here with our tool, and we're going to tighten these bolts to spec. It's only going to be probably about 1 1/4 turn, since that's all we did to loosen it, and have this whole thing ready to go, and then we can mount our ISR 2JZ engine bracket kit, and then eventually test fit it into the 240SX. So we'll see you then. All right, so as mentioned before, now we have to go ahead and torque these bolts within the clutch pack, and you can see the one right there. That's 1 out of the 6 we have going all the way around. So what we're gonna end up doing is having to turn the crankshaft from the nose up front to get this to turn every time we want to tighten another one. And because I want to try and stay with the theme of doing a star pattern torque and try and get this a good even seat with the clutch pack onto the back of the flywheel here, I'll have to do a couple of extra turns to hit one, skip one, hit the next, skip one, and keep doing that until they're all tight. So that's what we'll do with the tool here. And as you put this in and you torque it, you're only gonna be able to get a couple of clicks because of how small this inspection window is. So real pain in the ass, so make sure when you have a torque wrench that it is one that does a lot of little micro clicks and not one that has a lot of play in it, because if it does, this is gonna be an extremely frustrating job.
So I wanted to lay out the ISR engine mount kit so we can get an idea as far as what everything looks like. Over here is where one is fully assembled, and then one over here on the left hand side is completely disassembled. So these are all the parts you're going to make sure you have before you assemble this motor mount together. You can see it comes with all the bolts here, the nuts, and then the bushings. Bushing slid in pretty easily, a little bit easier than what I'm used to in other applications that use bushings as such, but a long bolt that'll go through here on the other end. Again, here it is here, completely assembled, and the instructions will also show you as far as which side each motor mount will go into on the JZ engine. So ISR made this a really easy mount to do onto a 2JZ, and we mentioned the welds earlier, but we'll go ahead and show you a quick close-up as far as the welds look. Everything just looks pretty sturdy, feels really good, and I like that they have everything coated, so I'm not worried about rust. And very, very flat on the backside. Everything sits nicely. This is a really, really good looking swap. Here it is mounted, and as I tested it into the 240 earlier, I did have to move these again, so you'll see that in a little bit. Also, you want to make sure that you use all 4 of these bolt holes on the side of the transmission, as well as the other side. I like to use some really strong leftover bolts I had from another flywheel setup, and then I like to mock up the bracket here for the rear trans. And what's weird about it is it's going to be a little bit shifted over to the right, so you're going to have the right side of the trans bracket will have more material hanging off, then on the left hand side we'll have just a little bit as a mount on the body, but it actually lines up in a 240 that way, so don't be worried if this isn't completely centered up on the bracket when it goes in. It's going to be offset quite a bit, so just go with it. The instructions show it, and testing the car, it seemed to work really good. Again, here's a another shot of me using all the bolt holes. All right, so it's going to be a mock fit test day for the 2J and the R154 transmission going into the 240. Been pulling a few things out of here, like some brackets, One which was welded down there from the factory, and one here as well. So just trying to create a lot more clearance. This is gonna get cut out anyways because that battery tray's rusted out pretty good. And eventually I'll flatten that out, smooth it, get some paint laid down. But HVAC system's still gonna come out, so I'll get that out a little bit later. And fuel lines obviously is gonna be rerouted to the other side. I might look online and see what kits they got, but that whole side will be cleared out. But just gonna test fit this, make sure everything's good, make sure that the ISR mounts all line up and then everything's good. I have nothing banging around, no clearance issues. I don't think I'm gonna have any. And once everything is fit in, if all is good, likely gonna leave it here for a few days. That way I can work on some other things. Gonna end up pulling the windshield wiper motor as well as all this trim up top here. That way I can make sure I get good paint on everything and have it all matching. I don't want, you know, black, gray, whatever color I'm gonna go with, and have like these weird red pieces that you'll see under that. So it's an S13 that's been wrecked before, so I'm not too concerned about being incredibly clean, but sometimes the OCD gets the best of me, and I'm just gonna make this like a super clean engine bay, get that in there. But yeah, we'll go and test fit, see how it works. Quick note, you cannot just use a chain or seatbelt to put this in. The motor has to get tilted at a pretty extreme angle with the transmission if you're gonna clear the tunnel. All right, so we have the motor mocked up in there, but unfortunately, one of the things I did not read about while doing JZ swaps in a S13 is the clearancing of the oil pan. Apparently, you do need a spacer or an aftermarket sway bar to get the clearance of the oil pan between the factory sway bar. So the oil pan is currently sitting on the sway bar, so I'm gonna get a spacer. Well, I'm gonna research between the spacer and the sway bar and really see what the difference is. But other than that, the transmission lined up nicely within the shifter hole. So once I have the tripod and everything else, looks like everything's gonna fit fine. There was no banging of the tunnel that was needed to put the R154 transmission in. So once I get the once I either go with the spacer or sway bar, we should be able to get that clearance, and then we'll be able to get this thing finally fitted and see if there's anything else we may need. Likely gonna leave the motor and trans in the car for a little bit so I can fit the drive shaft, as well as run some intercooler pipe and see how everything's gonna look in here when everything's done. I really don't want to paint this whole thing and then end up having to go back afterwards, cut, trim, you know, redo the paint, whatever. I want to go and get this fitted now, see what all is going to be needed to get the piping ran and the exhaust, etc. And then after that, we'll go ahead and button up the swap and then look to get it wired up. As mentioned before, we're also going to be test fitting the ISR one-piece drive shaft. I did end up springing extra $100 for the aluminum drive shaft. It was on sale, and I want to say that this thing came out looking really, really good. The welds look great. It's pretty lightweight, and it's just a really nice looking piece of ISR. This definitely exceeded expectations, and I was really happy to see it come out of the box. So the ISR aluminum drive shaft is in, and we still have the motor sitting here on the hoist, but what I wanted to do is just at least see if the one-piece drive shaft was going to give me any issues with sliding onto the back of the transmission or any alignment issues with the rear diff, but it lined up perfectly with the rear diff, sits flush, sits great, and as well as the splines on the transmission gave me no issues going on. This whole thing was butter. This was actually the easiest part of the swap, and I was really, really impressed with the quality of this drive shaft and see it fit so well. So definitely made my night. So wanting to get this thing completely bolted up and make sure everything lined up, I was having actually a little bit of problems jacking this thing the rest of the way up. I didn't force it. When you're working on cars, you never want to force anything. If it's not going, it's not fitting, it's not moving, don't force it. Start moving around, start inspecting. I was glad to see that at least the mount bolts in the rear on the cross member was lining up perfectly with the body, but it just still wasn't going up into the air, and I could not figure out what it was. Again, there was no banging of the transmission tunnel needed, and the rear bracket, again, will sit offset to one side further than the other on the 240 here, but it's fine. Shifter hole mounts up great too, but here it is. It's the ears on the tripod that hit. So I'm going to have to cut out this transettle up the top to clear those ears. So like most cross-brand swaps, not everything's going to go in as easily as you would like, but that's part of the process, learning and enjoying your swap. So everything's bolted up for now. We're going to wait till we get some of our parts in, then we'll complete a bit later, but thanks for dropping by.